Good afternoon again. Somehow I'm back here on the stage, but afterwards you won't see me for a while. What I forgot to include in this bio was NACA. Maybe some of you heard about this project. It's a network. It's a research network of 15 PhD candidates. We are spread around 8 universities in Europe, and there is quite amazing things happening. Among those, there is a conference coming up this month, later on this month in Cologne. So you're all welcome to join. It's a public event with, I think we have 10 invited speakers, 10 keynote speakers, and 15 of us are presenting samples of our researches. And there is a free entry, and I think there is still possible to register. And we booked a large room, so please feel invited. I should also thank for inviting me. It's not so common that I talk about conservation. I'm relatively new to the field. I started to dig into it maybe 3 years ago. And my focus is particularly documentation and of difficult art, media art, changing art or changeable artworks, about which I will be talking about today. So whether these works are installations or performances, they have special demands on collection care, as we already heard about today. While we can say that most artworks are unique and precious and self-contained objects, it is often not the case for these works. Let me give you an example. So this is a work by Hans Hake, which was first shown in 1969 as part of a Prospect 69 exhibition in Düsseldorf under the title Nachrichten. So during the show, a teletype machine kept printing out messages transmitted by German's fire service DPA. And on the day after the transmission, the paper printouts, which you can see on the edge on the floor, were displayed on the walls in the background for further reading. And eventually, on the third day, these rolls were labeled, dated, and stored in transparent tubular containers. So there was this ongoing process during the exhibition. An important thing to mention is that at the time of the exhibition, West Germany went through federal elections. Hake showed the same piece later that year in the United States at his solo show at Howard Weiss Gallery. There, the machine was not connected to DPA, but to United Press International News Service. In this installation, as in the previous one, the printed paper rolls were displayed after the date of transmission and then stored. And so in this case, they were displayed a little bit differently. Next year, in 1970, the piece was shown at the famous software exhibition at the Jewish Museum in New York. Here, Hake decided to use 5 instead of 1 teletype machines, simultaneously printing news reports from DPA, UPI, but also from New York Times and Italian service ENSA and Reuters. Rather than collected every day, the printouts accumulated on the floor and were not posted or preserved beyond the time of the exhibition. So we had these piles of printouts and paper accumulating during the exhibition. A similar setup was used almost 4 decades later in 2008 at SF MoMA. Here, however, teletype is replaced by a dot matrix printer connected to the internet and churning out news stories from RSS feeds of various news agencies from around the world. The museum acquired the work with this exhibition and kept only a sample of the printout for its artist's material archive. Most recently, the work was shown earlier this year again in the same place. Well, actually, same institution, but a different place. Its software, which existed previously only as a binary, had to be reverse engineered and programmed again from scratch so that the museum could make changes in its source code. So they wanted to change where the news came from. And they came from 18 various agencies selected by the artist. To make things even more complicated, this work exists in two more you can say editions, which I don't know more about who owns them, how they're shown, but they exist. So it's a multiple. Besides installation and technical setup, what has changed over the years is also context of the work. A year before making news in 1968, Hake gave a lecture about his artistic development. He talked about his gradual realization of the importance of recognizing movement as defining attribute of the world surrounding us, and taking it into consequences in his artistic practice. First, through gestural abstraction, optical place with perception, to later move away from creating illusionistic spaces completely to modeling objects with their own agency in space, their activation by audience, and later his shift to the elements of water and air. And this is where his lecture stopped, and this work was produced next year. This work was activated by electric network, and its medium was information. So when asked later about his original intention behind the piece, he also said that he aimed to open up gallery walls to the surrounding world and its politics. Also, this work was created during his involvement in the Art Workers Coalition. 50 years later, in the age of mobile devices and ubiquitous connectivity, this no longer resonates as strongly. So changeable works, such as media installations, might contain replaceable components, such as printers, screens, or software. They might involve an intricate system of behaviors and rules that need to be reproduced and followed for each version or iteration. They might need to be connected to an online service or website, which changes over time or even disappears at one point. They might have specific spatial and acoustic characteristics, and these might be only specified for a particular room and situation, not available anymore. They might be built for a particular context and then acquired decades later when this context is no longer possible to arrange anymore. In connection to permanent collection on display here at the Ludwig Museum, upstairs, I think we will have a guide tour tomorrow, we can talk in this manner about, for example, Jean Tinguely's motor-powered piece, My Wheels, or Claes Oldenburg's Lingerie Counter, or Tamas Auby's Mutant installation, or Konrad Smolinski's sound installation Mold Cage, shown right at the entrance to the exhibition. So these are all difficult, changeable works which need a special care. And to gain confidence in reinstalling them, we heavily rely on documentation. And not just on documentation of given artwork in general, but also on its evolution, its life stages, its respective versions, iterations, or if you want to make lives of our translators a little harder, instantiations. And even if this already requires a lot of work, it still might not be sufficient, because installation instructions and reports and photographs and emails and interviews with the artists are so dispersed and varied and piling up over time that we need to find ways how to organize all these documents in a way which makes us prepared for its future displays under changed conditions. While most condition management systems are failing us in this respect, in recent years, several initiatives responded to these challenges by implementing a supporting platform. And systems such as wikis came into focus as a prominent choice for managing documentation of media arts. In this talk, I will take the case of San Francisco's Museum of Modern Art Media Wiki to determine whether and under what conditions a wiki is capable of supporting collection care sufficiently enough in terms of documenting time-based media art. I'm using this term today because it is by now relatively well established in the conservation milieu, and several museums have conservators or even conservation departments dedicated to it. The Electronic Media Group of American Institute of Conservation defines the term as any artwork that has both physical and temporal dimensions. Very simple. I use this term synonymously with media arts and media installations today. So to document a time-based media artwork, people often suggest to identify its components and elements, and possibly including the space and acoustics, explain how they are connected, describe their roles in terms of aesthetics and functionality, and establish factors most likely to prevent each component from fulfilling its role. The process of documentation is hardly ever finished, and rather leads to a growing cache of documents. Throughout the stages of its life in a collection, which is acquisition and exhibitions and ongoing loans, various members of museum staff generate tombstone and contextual information and installation instructions and correspondence with the artist, more detailed artist interviews, preventive conservation requirements and condition and treatment reports and audiovisual documentation and so on. In addition, some of these documents are bound to particular iterations of the work. And lastly, documents also come in media formats as video, audio, and code. So in short, there is a need for a system which would accommodate multiple iterations of an artwork, relation between its elements and multimedia content, and present them in a concise manner. The importance of documentation in museum agendas vary widely, but it stands in the center of work of contemporary art conservation and is key in collection care since the lives of these works of art depend on it. However, as we said, existing collection management systems are mostly not fit to sufficiently support this cause. In effect, the documentation needed for restaging these works is dispersed across multiple systems and drives and computers and dossiers in various departments, often only with access limited to certain people. To tackle with these challenges, several initiatives began using wikis as supporting platforms for collection care. So for example, the ZKM had been using MediaWiki software to support work in a number of its departments, including media conservation for about 10 years. Guggenheim Museum's Panza Collection Initiative employed the Confluence Wiki to address the long-term preservation and future exhibition of works of the 60s and 70s, primarily minimalist, post-minimalist, and conceptual art. About 6 years ago, SF MoMA started using MediaWiki as a resource integrating documentation of media installations in its collection. Furthermore, SF MoMA also used Confluence Wiki as documentation resource for its The Artist Initiative, featuring research engagement with artists such as Ellsworth Kelly, William Selmans, and Julia Scher to support the preservation and display of their works in the collection. And the last example is Artists Archive Initiative, hosted or ran by New York University and launched last year. And this project also opted for Wiki, in this case MediaWiki, to create a knowledge basis on the works of artists such as David Wojnarowicz and John Jones. So despite this experimental use, it has not been determined so far whether and under what conditions a wiki is capable of supporting collection care sufficiently enough in terms of documenting time-based media art. So this is a working question of my talk. Albeit the wikis of all mentioned initiatives respond primarily to the intentions to document more sufficiently complex art in respective collections, they vary greatly in their content structure, functionality, and design. And this talk focuses on one of them. And since most of the mentioned projects are not active at the moment, and the Artist Archive initiative is not connected to a museum collection, I take the case of SMOMA's Media Wiki. And my talk is based on my field research conducted at Múzeum earlier this year. So what I'm going to do, I will first provide a short historical account of the place and care of media arts in SMOMA in order to describe aspects of its approach to media conservation. Then we turn to its recent efforts to assemble installation documentation and situate them in the context of Múzeum's information space. And this will create contextual space for analyzing the implementation of a wiki for its collection care. And finally, after establishing the criteria of sufficient support of documentation of time-based media art, we will determine whether and under what conditions a wiki is capable of meeting them. So let us talk first about the Múzeum's engagement with media art. It will become evident that these works form one of the pillars of its collection and therefore one of the main domains of collection care. SMOMA has been showing media installations since the late 60s. However, the more sustained focus on presenting and collecting media art came later when in 1988, the Múzeum established a new curatorial post for media arts taken up by Bob Riley. One of his first shows was American Landscape Video, which was instrumental for setting forward the path of exhibitions, collections, and conservation of these great ideas in fugitive forms. From among the works displayed there, Stina Wazulka's horizontally drifting 22-monitor video and sound installation, The West, was acquired by this museum, and it became Stina Wazulka's first museum purchase. Riley oversaw collecting not only contemporary works, but also aimed to establish a history of media arts, going back up to 20 years to retrieve works that in some cases have been lost and have required complete recreation. Across museum departments, he argued that unlike other works, media art demands us to accept it as a changeable and durable object and to acknowledge the consequences for the institution. That for the care of such ephemeral objects, the role of collaboration documentation is central, have been recognized by museums conservators as well. The future head of collections, Jill Sterrett, spoke about the need for special care that media arts require. Quote, "What is needed is an institutional memory which can recall a detailed account of the look, feel, and intention of the piece and the institutional foresight to anticipate the future trajectory of its ongoing technological evolution." This statement can be seconded by a more recent one by Joanna Phillips, Guggenheim's media conservator, who talked about this in connection with outsourcing this kind of work to external organizations. In 1995, a working group called Team Media has been formed as a platform for dialogue across departments in SMOMA. The Fluid group has included curators, conservators, collection managers, catalogers, registrars, and AV team, and since then it meets roughly monthly to discuss time-based media works in the collection. Discussions and negotiations about their installations, accessioning, lending, and documentation have informed their recognition and treatment of these works in the museum. Sterrett, whose position of Director of Collection and Conservation makes her coordinator of this group, emphasizes collaboration as its uniting element. She says, quote, "We upped our game by leaning on each other, and as a result, a deep culture of collaboration took root. Team Media has been at the center of our ever-expanding program of acquisition, display, and care of electronic media arts and design." From early on, SMOMA has been engaged in cross-institutional collaboration in media art conservation. Coinciding with the establishment of Team Media, the museum hosted Playback 96 Video Preservation Roundtable, which was the first international working group and symposium bringing together the fields of conservation, museology, and media arts to address the technical and ethical issues surrounding video preservation. In the following year, the museum participated in setting up a platform for these conversations on the national level in the States, the Electronic Media Group. And other research projects follow later on. For example, Take Archaeology in 2000 brought together 25 curators, conservators, and artists to examine the works from an exhibition installed at the museum. And in addition, between 2003 and 2015, SMOMA had partnered with New Art Trust, MoMA, and Tate in establishing guidelines for the care of media art as part of the Matters Media Art Consortium. So even if artworks are well documented, it becomes clear that when it comes to the exhibition, it is highly time-consuming to collect relevant documents in various formats, scattered across databases, drives, and stacks, with many of them accessible only to particular departments or persons. So what would a better approach look like? We will now look at one of the ways relatively common for museums. Little Paul, how many of you are familiar with this way of documenting works? 2? Okay, maybe not so common. 3. Yeah. Okay, so here we have dossier. So in connection to the ongoing research in matters of media art, one of SMOMA's conservators, Martina Heidvogel, was asked to test a new device system to organize the documentation of media installations. It might be used for all artworks, if successful. The system involved maintaining a preservation dossier for each work. The dossier was essentially a ring binder, bringing together documentation of various aspects of the work relevant for keeping it present in the institutional memory. Its structure had been devised in tandem with museums' engagement in media arts conservation research. Describing in detail the look, feel, and intention of media installations is something that is practiced across positions and across departments. From the start, dossiers were designed as a multi-authored and multi-voice records. Any department having relevant documents would make hard copies and file them in the respective folder for each concerned artwork. Curators would provide their descriptions along with contracts, and AV team and technicians, their own narrative, accompanied by installation instructions, assembled together with conservators who would add their requirements for preservation and collect interviews and correspondence with the artist and gallery. Inevitably, these roles would be slightly shifting case to case. The allographic nature of media installations makes it conditional that dossier on a piece is created almost exclusively on the occasion of its exhibition. The reports and materials are compiled mostly after the actual installation process, before the work went down. In result, dossiers brought documents from various formats into a common medium of paper. And documents such as installation kits and conservation reports, blah, 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 selected from across museums' information systems and intranet drives and paper folders were filed in a single dossier per artwork. And it was made up of several sections. I don't know, well, most probably you have no chance of reading them, but they're on the side. So there are as follows: curatorial description, and then technical narrative, and then installation documents, and then preservation requirements, and then artist interview, and then correspondence, and then exhibitions and loans, and contracts. The complexity of access control was reduced to having all dossiers available on a single shelf above a conservator's desk in a relatively easily accessible office. One of the main challenges was to coordinate this process. It required requesting particular people for particular documents in various levels of urgency. Heidvogel was essentially approaching curators to write prose on the works they have set up. Piece is more detailed than a gallery wall description, but much more simple than the catalog text, something really for audience of museum stuff. She was regularly working with her other colleagues, among conservators, technicians, and registers, on narratives from their own perspectives. Content-wise, there was not much else other than what they have been used to do anyway on various occasions, such as installation process, loans, presentation, and so on. The difference was in the overall editorial process. The conservator hesitantly took up. Dossiers were meant to aid collaboration in the institution and therefore ought to be written in more accessible language. Ideally, the curatorial, preservational, technical, artistic, and legal languages and their vocabularies would be fine-tuned towards some shared expression. However, dossiers sitting on the shelf above the conservator's desk on the 8th floor did not possess flexibility to provide an inclusive enough environment for shared narratives. So the material form of a dossier also caused other obstacles. Making a dossier is a laborious process because documents have to be copied or printed, perforated, and filed. Afterwards, bound in a ring, the dossier resists being reproduced easily and ends up being limited to a single unit each, unavailable when checked out. It was like a library with a single copy per book. Besides its great demands on coordination, the material form of a dossier is not flexible enough to serve as interdepartmental communication medium and creates limitations in practical use in terms of access, production, and reproduction. After several months, it became evident that in this approach to tying together documentation, shortcomings surpass benefits, and it needs to be altered. One such alteration is to make it digital, which in turn necessitates embedding it within the museum's digital information system. In order to understand how a new information system would fit in the framework of SFMOMA's existing collection-related information architecture, I will first introduce its structure and context very briefly. From the perspective of collection documentation, information relevant to the sustainability of an artwork begins to be collected long before the work enters the building. Descriptions of components of the work and intention behind it and various spatial and technical dependencies are accumulated in mailboxes and hard drives of curators and conservators and other stuff. Large museums like SFMOMA operate a complex patchwork of digital systems and channels for organizing information relevant to a specific artwork in their collection. These computer systems span decades back. First came Embark, which the museum embraced in 1995, so more than 20 years ago. Its original promise was simple: to manage collections using a single system present across the museum's computer network. Embark was created as part of the wave of a new generation of collection management systems running on relational databases, first of which emerged in the mid-80s. Shortly after the system was fully deployed at the SFMOMA, the company was merged with Gallery Systems, the firm responsible for the museum system, CMS, originally developed for the Met. Today, while TMS has been claimed as the most extensively used CMS for the management of conservation documentation in art museums, Embark is generally considered its junior version, and it is used only rarely, despite being more lightweight and affordable. Yeah, actually, this I also want to make use of opportunity of doing very quick poll. So, how many people have worked with TMS in the past? 4? Okay, and how many people are familiar with Mimsy? Mimsy CMS? No one? It's quite popular in certain museums, or maybe different places. Museum Plus? Yeah, 3. And Adlib? Okay, this is something very Dutch, huh? So, despite the current status quo of web-basedness of applications, Embark remains bound to desktop. It was designed in the mid-90s using the then relatively novel technology of relational database, which was then bound to desktop applications. Around the time, web browsers were starting to gain traction. However, they represented a different tradition. Embark was built as a desktop software, in principle as the computerized database version of collection catalog, enabling such new functions as automated search and remote access. On the other hand, web browsers offered graphical extension to network communication and data transfer. And unlike databases that were relational on the level of meticulously structured data items, websites offered relationality on the level of linked freestyle documents. And it would take several years before MySQL clients and Apache web servers would gain traction and bring these two paradigms together. So this is just to a point why this application was not web-based. It was not, it was a kind of different paradigm then. So Embark remains to be a desktop application without an API, and its further development is greatly limited by its employment of now little used 4D database system. With all its idiosyncrasies, Embark CMS is still central to SFMOMA's collection management. This is where registrars compile Thomson data and, in case of installations, create additional records for each component. Collection managers and curators and conservators add notes specific to the work, even though many of the staff and collaborators don't interact with the CMS at all and keep documents using their own means. The proper documentation of an installation usually happens before it goes down from the show. This is the point when the piece has been stabilized and members of the team are confident to retrospectively describe how they reached that point. Reports they write are stored primarily on shared drives or paper folders of respective departments. Oh my God. Photographs and visual documentation, more broadly, is collected on shared drives from where it is meant to be copied further to what the museum called Digital Garden, which stands for Digital Asset Management System they are using since 3 years ago. And contrary to Embark, it comes with a clean and easy-to-use interface and is available through a web browser. SFMOMA's Information Commons counts far more systems. The blue bars on this diagram are connected to Embark in one way or another. Each system has its own idiosyncrasies and demands on the user. Introducing yet another piece to the puzzle means facing reluctance, requiring a special lasting effort from the members of the staff. And its place in the information space needs to be negotiated. So what is to answer next is why the museum chose to replace paper-based preservation dossiers by a wiki and not by other digital solution. Such a choice, like any, also begs the question what kind of changes were brought into the documentation process in result. So let me see. I got a little... So what I'm gonna do, I have this section about particular features of MediaWiki, and I will skip them today, but there will be time to go more into detail on using Wiki for documentation tomorrow during the workshop. Okay? So, yeah, this is just a couple more minutes now. So to make a paper dossier digital today, one would do well simply to scan it into PDF file. The PDF is now an ISO standard for digital documents. And the self-contained and compact format is readily usable for electronic distribution. And also for display on screen and professional print. However, for the purpose of creating reference for preservation, this is impractical. If not for other things, then for the hassle with inconsistent versions of dossier due to changes and additions. It will exist as a paper dossier and simultaneously as multiple copies of PDFs of various versions. Instead, one may opt to minimize the need for printing and scanning and rather collect source files from which they were printed for a dossier. So this would be Word documents and images and PDFs and email threads, and in addition, digital copies of those with no source file available, such as contracts that arrived by post. It does make sense to have a shared space where they can be situated together. This space, presenting a collection of multimedia documentation or artworks, would primarily serve not a single department, but museum staff in general, ideally generations of museum staff. The variety of file formats in such a collection presents a problem for concise presentation. One option would be an intricate file listings known to the staff from their shared drives. However, this is very limited, especially due to the fragmentation of information into individual files, the lack of file previews, and the lack of versioning, and the lack of remote access. A more distributed solution, such as Git, would help the issues of access, versioning, and previews of some formats. However, it too offers only a highly fragmented and impractical perspective on an artwork. Another candidate, CMS, as we said, generally lacks support for multiple iterations of an artwork, for relations between various elements, and often also the features mentioned before. Digital asset management systems are highly adequate for handling large quantities of multimedia content, such as images and video. However, like CMS systems, they fail in other respects. So instead, Heitvogel foresighted implementing a content management system, a web-native space with inclusive interface design, where respective files from a dossier would be displayed side by side in a continuous succession of narratives. Multimedia and other files would be placed, ideally embedded within. Entries on artworks would be structured as in a dossier. The system would have straightforward access and version control. As the work of Team Media has shown, media installations have the ability to bring people across departments together, and this place should be their platform, at hand to everyone in a group. The choice fell on Wiki, despite being employed in museum contexts rather scarcely. Okay, so now I would go through. So this is a warm-up for tomorrow. Various aspects of this platform, and we skip this kind of general overview of features relevant for these purposes. And yeah, so to conclude, I can say that there is only a handful of companies developing collection systems for art museums in particular. Gallery Systems, with the museum system, are clearly dominating the market. Several other companies develop systems for other museum fields, such as history. The costs of transfer to a different system are mostly too high for it to happen. As a result, the field is innovating, albeit not particularly reinventing itself. Museums are left developing DIY procedures to support missing features. This talk has examined how an implemented collection management system, regardless of its model, may be supported by another application, namely MediaWiki, in its mission to document Taiwanese media art in particular, even though you haven't heard much about it. The choice of this platform might sound contra-intuitive for at least two reasons. Firstly, there are several open source projects aimed toward collecting institutions such as collective access and conservation space. Their utility for this purpose is yet to be investigated. Secondly, MediaWiki has been incepted as a public knowledge platform to operate Wikipedia. Therefore, it does not have access control at its core. A museum operating with sensitive materials about contemporary art, on the other hand, would rather imagine running a private system with an option of providing guest access to partners. What more, the absence of any file folders and the need to handle digit files on the same level as cumulative articles about works imposes special requirements for grasping the structure of this platform. And finally, for those uninitiated to its markup language called Wikitext, learning MediaWiki's language poses another challenge. So if by some means an organization is capable of overcoming these limitations, MediaWiki could stand as a relatively affordable means to meet the ends of preserving time-based media art. Operating content management systems in museums has been mostly the domain of digital departments operating websites of their institutions. They are the people to reach out for collaboration. At the same time, the process of editing and documenting an artwork on a wiki may yield additional benefits for conservators, curators, and technicians as a means to further the craft of presenting and publishing case studies. Thank you very much.